This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong. And I do this bearing in mind the comments of the Leader of the Opposition saying that making such a welcome is a token gesture. It isn't a token gesture, it's an acknowledgement of dispossession, and also it means that finally we are beginning to know the people who occupied and lived here for millennia. So it is an important acknowledgement. And interestingly enough, John Ralston Saul's latest book, A Fair Country, Telling Truths About Canada, makes an argument about the importance of Indigenous people to understanding the identity of that country. As President of Melbourne Pen, it's exciting to welcome and introduce John Ralston Saul for many reasons. As we've heard, one of his many guises is his position as President of International Pen. Formed in 1921 to promote the interests of writers across national borders, PEN now has over 140 centres in 100 countries. John's tour coincides with a special year for PEN, marking the 50th anniversary of the Writers in Prison Committee. Set up in 1960 in response to the rising persecution of writers worldwide, the committee advocates on behalf of thousands of writers who have incurred the wrath of the state. They could be imprisoned, threatened, harassed, and even murdered for the peaceful pursuit of their craft. Now, in taking the two dates, 1921 and 1960, and linking them, John Ralston Saul has said, International Pen was created out of the scars of World War I to bring societies back together through their literature. Constant violence against writers quickly forced us to realise that free speech and literature are one and the same thing. PEN is the foremost and oldest freedom of expression organisation in the world, and since 1960 the Writers in Prison Committee has set the standard around the world for defending not just the rights of writers but the free speech of everyone, unquote. To mark the anniversary, PEN is conducting a year-long campaign named Because Writers Speak Their Minds. The annual case list contains the names of almost 900 persecuted writers, editors, journalists and internet writers. The name of the campaign, Because Writers Speak Their Minds, is taken from the 1960 speech formally proposing the Writers in Prison Committee. The first 50th anniversary mini-campaign concerned Iran and was launched with a coalition of human rights organisations in February. So it's fabulous that the Melbourne Writers Centre has entered into a partnership with Melbourne Pen to welcome John Ralston Saul and to have him speak to us tonight. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce John. He is a prolific writer, commentator, human rights advocate and a long-time champion of freedom of expression. His books include 5 novels, including the bestseller Birds of Prey, dealing with modern power and its clash with the individual. He's also the author of 10 books of non-fiction. His philosophical works include Voltaire's Bastards, The Doubter's Companion and The Unconscious Civilization, and On Equilibrium. John's ideas have influenced political and economic thought in many countries, and his works have been translated into 22 languages. He's the recipient of many awards, including Chile's Pablo Neruda Medal, Canada's Governor-General's Literary Award, and recently Korea's Manhei Grand Prize for Literature, otherwise known as their equivalent to the Nobel Prize. Now, reading John Ralston Saul, I am struck by his encyclopedic knowledge, prodigious research and his grasp of both economic theory and practice. He can be placed in the tradition of the great political philosophers and possesses a rare ability to draw upon and synthesize many disciplines: philosophy, literature, economics, history, the social sciences, and his direct observations and extensive travels, and still write with great clarity. He is a true public intellectual whose books address and engage a wide audience. John takes all these disciplines into account in his now celebrated book, The Collapse of Globalism and the Reinvention of the World, published in 2005. The book is a powerful and convincing critique of globalism, in which John warned that globalism was already collapsing, and if we did not act quickly, we would be caught in a crisis and limited to emergency reactions. It's one of those books that is so rich in ideas, imagination, constructive suggestions, and information that you are tempted to notate and quote page after page. If there is one concept that embodies John's thinking, it is his profound humanism. It is the human that lies at the heart and soul of his writing and activism. He never loses sight of real lives, real citizens, real individuals and their communities, and is damning about all political and economic practices that lose sight of the human, and damning about the abstract theories and ideologies that justify these practices. So please join me in welcoming John Ralston Saul.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be back in Melbourne. I actually haven't been in this theatre before with its understated ceiling. It's fantastic. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if it's one of a kind, but it ought to be, because it really is astonishing, and it shouldn't be imitated. It's just too good. It's wonderful to be here. It's raining in Sydney. I just thought I'd point that out. And sunny here, but I had a wonderful time, I must say, at the Sydney Festival, and I was thrilled to be able to come here back to the Melbourne Festival in a pre-event, and also to visit Melbourne Pen. This country is very lucky. You've got two incredible pen centres, both of them very active, both inside Australia, throughout Asia, and at the international level. So a lot of the people involved in Melbourne Pen play a big role in international pen. And you heard from Arnold, this thing started out with a couple of writers saying we just got to stop killing each other in the 1920s, and now it's probably about 20,000 members around the world. And there are another 20,000 who, if they joined, would immediately go to prison or be shot or whatever. So it is the cutting-edge freedom of expression organization in the world. And of course, it is the only international literary organization, truly international literary organization. And as Arnold said, we've got sort of almost 1,000 writers on our writer in prison list. But it's really hard to know what to do. This is a very sophisticated organization because we have to fight each one of those fights one at a time, and each one of them is a different story. There are about 40 writers in prison in China, and perhaps how many more on the edge of going to prison. How do we deal with that? It's very complicated. It's interesting. I think there are things that can be done. On the other hand, which is the country where the most writers have been killed in the last 5 years? Just shout it out. Anybody got any ideas? Well done. Was that a member of PEN? No, well done. Because very few people get that. 30 writers killed in Mexico in the last 5 years. President of our PEN Center in Tunisia is regularly beaten up. I mean, that's a life, right? Regularly beaten up. And we can go through the stories one after the other. And this is very real. Freedom of speech is not some sort of abstraction or some sort of curious thing that only writers know about. It has to do with writers in prison, writers in exile, which is another form of prison, because often in exile you're reduced to silence, which is a form of prison. We work, and I'm really excited to hear those acknowledgements of the traditional lands, because it's so important, because it's the sense of the continuity and the reality of the past in the present and the future. And one of the things that we're increasingly working on are minority languages, and in particular endangered indigenous languages. After all, can you think of a bigger, a more drastic removal of freedom of expression than the destruction of a language? That is the ultimate silence. And frankly, every one of you who is not Indigenous, and I could say this as a Canadian, would be the same story, the fact that you will never speak these languages or know anything about these languages is beside the point. The fact that they're not going to have an international utilitarian role is beside the point. The point is that those are the doors into the millennia collective unconscious of this continent. And every one of those languages that disappears is a door slamming shut on the deep understanding of this place. And so somebody who immigrates to Australia and becomes a citizen tomorrow loses as much as anybody else, because they're losing access to that astonishing collective unconscious, that subconscious, that continuity through history. And so we're working in those areas. We're working in our African centers on literacy. A lot of the writers are creating libraries throughout 13 countries. But all of this is not to say that PEN is about writers. If you read, you're as important as the writer. In fact, you're probably more important in some ways, because you are the continuity. If you're at a theater, you're more important than the speaker, really. And so when we talk about freedom of expression, we're talking about reading and writing, we're talking about communication, we're talking about talking and listening. And if I may be so pedestrian, there is a table out there, a PEN table, and you can join PEN. Any one of you can join PEN. And by joining PEN, you're actually playing a role in your own freedom of expression. And even if the Melbourne people will be more polite than me about this, I'm not at all polite when it comes to this. You join, it's your freedom of expression here and around the world, and we want you and need you. And I thought about all of this when I arrived on last Saturday, and I went straight up to the Blue Mountains to recover from the short trip. And I stayed in a well-known hotel. It was fairly touristy, and I went off to Echo Point, a very touristy place, in a sense very, very beautiful, but quite touristy. And it was a nice day. And there, on the ground, were all these families, what we would call new Canadians, and I think the term has a less happy past here, but people who have immigrated and become citizens, or are going to become citizens and become Australians. And there they were, all sitting, eating foods from different parts of the world, dressed in different ways, speaking in different languages. And I've seen this in places like Niagara Falls in Canada, and I find it incredibly moving, because of course what they're doing is they're coming out into iconic places that have to do with what Australia is. And they're identifying themselves with it by putting out a blanket and having a picnic in that place. They're declaring themselves in public to be Australian in some new and different and complicated way by sitting on those blankets and having those meals and being seen to be Australian in an Australian place. It's very, very moving. I think it's astonishing and tells us how we're starting to learn, I think, in countries like yours and mine, to understand that the monolithic, simplistic ideas of belonging that came out of Europe and the United States are simply inappropriate to sophisticated 21st century countries like ours. We do not belong in the 19th century. We are the postmodern countries. And in the postmodern countries, complexity, difference, diversity, what I call multiple personality orders, It's a good thing, right? It's not the disorder, it's the order. These are what make us interesting and make it possible that we're going to contribute something interesting. And so I thought about all of that on Saturday as I was walking around, thinking that there are in countries like Australia astonishing opportunities to be original, not to reinforce the tired old European ideas of the monolithic Westphalian, European-style nation-state. They're tripping over themselves. You know, they killed 100 million Europeans. 100 million Europeans were killed by Europeans, and some of us who went along to help, right, in a good cause, but between 1914 and 1945. In order to, if you stand back from it, in order to assert the possibility of, or to oppose the possibility of the monolithic nation-state. It was the end of a 500-year attempt to create that kind of European-style nation-state. We don't need that. We're not going that way. I can't think, if I had to think of two places that are completely un-British and un-European, it would be Australia and Canada, because we actually stand for the precise opposite of everything that they stand for, because we stand for complexity and multiplicity. And that's very exciting. That's a fabulous thing, because that places you in a position to deal with what's happening in the world today. It places you in quite an original and, in a sense, revolutionary place. So, in spite of what I've just said, here we are, sophisticated, sorry about that, here we are, sophisticated, urban, cappuccino drinking Australians, and particularly in this city, probably the most cappuccino drinking city of Australia because of its origins. I've been in some of the fantastic old Italian bars here. In spite of this vision of ourselves as being ourselves as being these urban people who live through service industries and who are tied to the world in some spatial way which doesn't involve most of the time the outback or 90% of the country or whatever, and that's why it's so good to hear that acknowledgement at the beginning. In spite of that, Australia is probably more dependent on commodities today than it's been for half a century. So there's this profound, and the same is true of Canada, that if you actually take away the raw materials, what's left is probably a country with a developing nation economy. If you take away, I don't know what it is in Canada, it's 30-35% the raw materials representing the GDP. Probably more than that here, probably 30 to 40%. Does anybody know? No? Well, it'll be around 35%, I would guess. If you take that away, the whole thing falls apart. Melbourne falls apart, Sydney falls apart, Canberra definitely falls apart. And all of this, in a way, I think you would find if you looked at the numbers that you've actually are more dependent on commodities today than you were in 1970, I would guess. And that's because over the last 10 years, there's been a serious sliding backwards into dependency on commodities. That the service industry, the virtual industry idea, the urban industry idea didn't take over. And in spite of that, we haven't identified to ourselves that that's what's happened. And we haven't come to terms with the fact that after 4 decades of globalization, which was supposed to lead all of us, including you, in this new postmodern virtual direction, you're actually as dependent or more dependent on commodities than at the beginning of globalization. After 4 decades, everything is still being run on the basis of 19th century English, French, and German ideas of progress, ideas that belong with the first and second waves of the Industrial Revolution, deeply anchored in linear Enlightenment ideas of rationality, which I would call false rationality, that talk about progress in which one moves forward and leaves things behind. Growth, which is one of the outcomes of continually moving forward, that's why one continually needs growth, and that gradually becomes the definition of civilization, moving forward, leaving stuff behind, and growing into the future. The interesting thing is that here we are, and most countries, you've been a little bit exempted, and Canada's been a little bit exempted because of our natural resources, not because of our brains, from the current crisis. The stuff was in the ground, right? We didn't invent it. So we don't really get any marks for it being in the ground, to be honest about ourselves. Right? I can only speak this way in Australia. It's really great. I feel very at home when I talk this way. here we are, most of the countries more in debt than they were in 1970, more dependent on commodities than they were in 1970, and in the middle of an environmental crisis, in the middle of a crisis of global warming, and unable to deal with it because actually we didn't make any progress on this front in the last 40 years. We're starting to make some progress now, but it's incredibly slow, and it certainly has nothing to do with government cooperation and international agreements. It has to do with individual initiatives, usually at a local level. So, you know, what's fascinating is that this process, which was supposed to make us so much more flexible in every possible way, that we could do new things, in spite of that, here we are faced with what you might call unreasonable risks. I mean, this is a great country for horse racing and betting on horses, right? I think it would be very interesting to take the people who have the tote bag or whatever it's called, put them in charge for a while, because they actually know what a risk is. And they know when you bet and what you bet on and what you don't bet on most of the time. And I think this is acceptable to most people, if it's true that there's a 50-50 chance that there is global warming, you know, let's be conservative about this. And if there's a 50-50 chance that that global warming is caused by human beings and it's not cyclical or it's not entirely cyclical, then that is an unacceptable risk. If you wait around to prove it in, you know, classic utilitarian, European, rational, linear, Kantian, Platonist terms to get the truth so that it's not about superstition, well, that'll be fine. I mean, you'll have the truth. Of course, at that very moment, your grandchildren are going to be fried if you're wrong, right? Because it'll be too late. So it's an unacceptable risk. And yet you have the most educated civilizations in the history of the world. More people have more education than ever before in the history of the world, and yet they can't bring themselves to act on the basis of what is obviously an unacceptable risk, even though it may seriously mean that their grandchildren will fry. That's a very interesting point. I mean, you know, if you say, okay, so you mean you're willing to take this risk, even if it means your grandchildren fry? That's the question to ask, right? There is no other question, really, to ask, because it's direct and it's human and it focuses us. I've flown over the years, over the last 30 or so years, regularly over glaciers in northern Canada. I've seen pretty well all of them. And glaciers it's pretty straightforward, you know. There are these mountain peaks, and then there's a bowl at the top in between the mountains, and they're filled with glaciers. And then there are the valleys coming down around them, and the valleys are filled with the glaciers. It's sort of, it's like a big poisonous spider, except it's not poisonous. The arms big white arms coming down the valleys, and at the bottom, it looks like the pad of a spider's claw or paw, and they break up at the end and fall over into the ocean and become icebergs. Sort of almost looks like a chessboard when they're about to fall over. And we took photographs of all of these glaciers in the 1940s and 50s, so we know exactly what they look like. And you fly over them today, and in every single case, the legs have melted 500 yards, a kilometer up the valley. Of course, I mean, just because they're getting smaller doesn't mean they're melting, right? I mean, that's where we are. I mean, that's where we are in a kind of self-destructive intellectualism, which prevents us from looking at what any fool could look at and say, gosh, there may be a problem here. Maybe we should actually do something as opposed to negotiate about doing something. And it is indeed European philosophy and Western methodology and 19th century English economics which dominate today. Globalism is 19th century English economics, you know. Buccaneer capitalism and free trade, that's mid-19th century English economics. It's nothing new about it. It's all of those things which actually prevent action. It's the silo approach of our universities, which means that it's almost impossible to have any kind of integrated thought, which would allow one to say, gosh, forget the numbers, just have a look. Maybe we should do something really fast, just in case. And so we're prevented from doing that, not by some evil force. Not, you know, of course there are people lobbying and all the rest of it, but that's not what stops us. Lobbyists never stopped us if we didn't want them to stop us. It's our own conception of ourselves as 19th century Europeans, as people caught up in a logic of false rationality, which prevents us from actually simply doing something about all of this. It's a manager's dream or nightmare, which is to say everything is about control as opposed to action. So here we are in a country like Australia and Canada, so dependent on these raw materials, which have other implications further on down the road. And of course, it's a great economic strength in the short term. There's no question about that. And we've been in that short term for some time. But it's also a great weakness. And it links us in a very contradictory way to our attitudes towards the land, what you heard referred to twice tonight, which is an acknowledgement of the land and the people of the land. When you say that, you're actually saying something which immediately relates to what do we think about our dependence on commodities. And the other thing it tells us is that this is a country which has the enormous great and good fortune to have within it other philosophical traditions, in particular the philosophical traditions of Australia, which are the indigenous philosophical traditions, which are of this place, and which are, what's fascinating about them is, of course, that they are profoundly non-linear, non-rational, not irrational, non-rational. They are not flat, they're not pyramidal. They're circular or they're spatial. And of course, when you're dealing with enormous issues like global warming and enormous economic crisis, it's the spatial approach which will get you out. The linear approach locks you into the problem because you're always responding to the problem. The spatial approach allows you to step outside or to step inside the bigger picture and to see that there are, in fact, other possibilities. And that's an enormous advantage. If we could just convince ourselves that we don't have to be colonial. I mean, you don't hear people saying that much anymore. But you know, look at what we're teaching in our departments of philosophy and our departments of political science and history and economics. Look at the way we're teaching it. We're teaching it as if we were simply the children of Europe. And it is not appropriate to what is happening today. And here, as in Canada, you have the opportunity to actually take a leadership role because you actually have living here this other approach, which actually is, you know, it may be thousands of years old, but today, when you look at what's happening in the world, rationality, linearity, managerism, all of that stuff is terribly old-fashioned, terribly 19th century. Whereas the thousands of year old stuff, the spatial stuff, is incredibly modern, in fact postmodern. It couldn't be more modern. It is the most modern thing happening in the world today, these spatial approaches towards philosophy and how to think about society, how to think about human beings inside the place as opposed to human beings above the place, which is the basis of European civilization and which is the basis of movements, economic movements such as globalism. We've always rejected that because we've always wanted somehow to be European. And gradually, I think, more and more people are saying, no, we're from here. And if we're from here, we're really from here. And that means that there is access to this astonishing other intellectual tradition. The phrase here often used is dream time. And of course, you know, in English, as soon as you say the word dream, there's a sort of implication that it's not practical. But it couldn't be more practical. It's the utilitarian which has got us into global warming and can't get us out of it. It's the utilitarian which has got us into overproduction, which is good and bad. You know? It's the utilitarian which can't tell us how to produce without wages falling or how to deal with a rich-poor divide. So the whole rational utilitarian approach is not working out in the long run. It may have worked out in the medium to short term, but it hasn't worked out in the long run. This other approach is an astonishing opportunity. So in 1999, I came, I think for the second time to Australia and had a conversation which led me to give a speech in Sydney on national television where I said that I felt that globalism was collapsing and it was basically almost over. It was one of those evenings when you stand up and you think, okay, this may be the end of my career. I'm about to make a total fool of myself. But I just had this feeling, and I'll come back to this, that was what was happening. And it was coming here that finally convinced me that that was what was happening. And every time I'm on the edge of saying this in public, my wife and other people say to me, for God's sake, don't say that. It's like you're saying, I told you so, and people just hate that. Protestant modesty. The worst thing you can do when you're right is to admit it. You have to get someone else to say it. And if you're Catholic, well, I mean, it just brings out layer upon layer of guilt if you appear to be right in public, and it's a terrible way to make enemies, being right. It's far better to be wrong. And anyway, that's a whole other subject. T.S. Eliot said, humankind cannot bear very much reality, and so one is supposed to not say, I told you in 1999. But what the hell? I think that one shouldn't take that kind of modesty too seriously. It was clear, and I'm not the only one, it was clear to me by 99 that it was over. We were heading into what I would call an interim phase, a post-globalist phase, a vacuum after globalization in which there would be disorder. The elites would continue because, of course, that's what they're trained to do. But underneath them, there would be disorder. And what I kept saying was, you've got 5 to 10 years to get your act together, all of us, and come up with how to get out of this interim phase into a new phase. Because if you don't move quickly, events will take over. And once the events take over, we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to respond to the events. And that is, in effect, where we are now. We lost the opportunity to actually lead the way into the next era. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't get out of the disaster, and that I'm not a pessimist, or I wouldn't bother, traveling 40 hours in order to give a speech. It would be really foolish if you were a pessimist. So I believe that one can get out of these. But it is so much more difficult because we wasted all of that time, because of that need to pretend that everything was under control, that the managers were handling things, that nothing, serious had happened, that you couldn't connect the dots between all the catastrophes between 1995 and 2000 and 2001 and 2002 and so on. They were just sort of oddities that would be handled and things would go on. In fact, that is not at all what's happened. When I talk about the collapse of globalism, people will often say, well, what do you mean by globalism? And you're just talking about neoconservatism. You're just talking about Margaret Thatcher and George Bush. Well, actually, no, I'm not. That's not what I'm talking about. Because everybody in position of authority bought in. Almost everywhere in the West or in the developed economies, they bought in. The liberals bought in, the Social Democrats bought in, the neoconservatives, of course, bought in, the conservatives bought in, the managers bought in, the universities bought in big time. The departments of economics went through a kind of an economist version of ethnic cleansing, which was intellectual cleansing, in which they removed from their departments virtually every economist who disagreed. I mean, when they retired, they were replaced by people who agreed. People who disagreed were alienated, were not published, so that today, even though we're in a crisis, when a prime minister asks a minister of finance, who asks the deputy minister, who asks the director, who asks the economist what to do, what comes back up is the same old stuff. You go into our departments of economics all around the world, they're teaching the same stuff they taught 10 years ago and 15 years ago. They're still talking about, the natural market balance and all the rest of it, even though it's been proved wrong, because they control the places. They are the king without clothes, the ultimate king without clothes. But as long as there's nobody in there disagreeing with them, they just continue on. There's a handful of people who disagree, and they're heard more than they were. But in spite of the fact that even now they have several Nobel Prizes, the people who disagree, in spite of that, the universities go on teaching the same stuff they taught in the 70s and 80s and 90s, as if nothing had happened. As a result, it becomes increasingly difficult for governments of the right or the left or the middle to get advice on what to do. So why am I making such a fuss about the word globalism? It's really important because you have to act as if language means something, otherwise you can't figure out when you got it wrong. So, between 1970 and 1995, it was very clear what the true believers meant by globalism. They essentially meant that the world would be seen through an economic prism. That for the first time in history, at a large level, one would openly attempt to run the world through an economic prism, that everything else would be secondary or tertiary, that cultural policy would be looked at through economics. Everything would be universities would be looked at through economics. Social policy would be looked at through economics. That their primary purpose would be to meet standards set in an economic prism. And that's a really revolutionary idea, and it hasn't worked. It simply hasn't worked. But it isn't helpful today to have people saying, oh, no, globalization means, and then they've got some new thing that it means. In other words, what's happening is, faced by the failure of 30 years of globalization, they're attempting to redefine it to mean something else. So that anything that's international is globalization. No, it isn't. Globalization is a school which had 30 to 40 years to run the world. And they'll say they never had enough power. They had a lot of power. They ran the world. They changed the rules around the world for 30 to 40 years. They got a really long run. 30 to 40 years is a long run in terms of public policy. And at the end of it, we're in crisis. In the end of it, we're doing the opposite of what they said would happen if we did globalization. And therefore, it is extremely important to say, this is what you said in 1960 when you started writing it. This is what you said in 1973 when you started taking part. This is what you were saying in PhDs, in government policies, in OECD reports, in World Bank reports, in bank reports, in election campaigns, everywhere. This is what you were saying globalization was. This is what you were saying we should do. And this is what you said would be the outcome. Now let's look at the outcome. That's the way you have to do it. And if you do that, you see A, that it's collapsed, and B, that it didn't work. I mean, some things worked, but that generally speaking, it did not work. And so it's extremely important to be tough about the language. So today, another part of the economic prism is at the fore, the financial prism. And there's a sort of sense, well, we must save things. We must stay calm. We must keep everything in place. You see, it's still this continuity, which is false continuity, if what you're saving isn't worth saving. If what you're saving isn't real, isn't doing anything. You're actually tying down civilization in order to save something which actually doesn't have any purpose. And there would be other ways of dealing with it if we were courageous enough to say what all good ministers of finance have said for thousands of years, starting with Solon in Athens. If it's bad debt, rip it up, more or less. Break the chains, is I think what was his phrase, because he was a good poet. But what Solon said, what Sully said under Henry IV, again and again and again, when faced with this kind of financial crisis, you clear the decks. You clear the decks in a clever way so that citizens don't suffer, but you get rid of the excess finance, which is not useful or meaningful. And the thing is, why it's particularly important to do that is because this is not a financial crisis. Any more than 1970s was an oil crisis. This is a crisis which is a sign of what's going on. It has to burst, the boil comes up somewhere, bursts somewhere, becomes painful somewhere, but it's representative of something far broader. So it's very important to lance it, to squeeze the pus out, and allow the body to become helpful again. Otherwise, you're into a misdiagnosis of what's going wrong. You begin to think that there's a financial crisis, when actually there's a crisis about the theory necessary for running a civilization in the early 21st century. The worst thing we could be doing is to spend a lot of our societal efforts protecting failed ideas and failed systems. There are very basic ideas about money. I mean, first of all, money isn't real. Money is an imaginary object. It's a theory. We don't know exactly how much money you need vis-a-vis reality in order to make reality function, but we know it's a multiple. It's probably a multiple of somewhere between 5 and 20 or something like that. And indeed, in 1970, there were 6 times more currency traded than real goods. By the 1980s, it was 25 times, and that's when I wrote Voltaire's Bastards and had a whole chapter about how we were heading into a major financial crisis. I always get my timing a bit wrong. It's a bit early, but it was there in 93. You could see it when I wrote it. By 1995, we were up to 50 times more currency than real traded goods, and now I have no idea what it is. Maybe it's 80 times or something. Well, it's clear that it probably would be just as well if it were somewhere around 20 times. In other words, about 60 times is just inflation, which is why we had this particular crisis, because it's not real, because it had to do with people who didn't have money buying profitable companies and then borrowing heavily against the profits on those companies in order to pay for buying them, thereby crippling those companies, then selling off the bits and pieces of them. When you describe it, I can do that. If you can do that in one or two sentences, and it sounds as silly as it just sounded, you know that this had nothing to do with money being useful. It had nothing to do with creating wealth. It had nothing to do with progress. It had to do with speculation, old-fashioned South Sea bubble style speculation, which should not be taken seriously. And this last crisis, it was really hysterical, what was done, because it showed you how many of the people, the economists involved with finance, how many of them are male and of a generation of men who don't know anything about cooking. Because, of course, basically, an economy is like a cake, and in order to make the cake nice, you need some egg whites to put on top, to put in between. You need a certain amount of egg whites for the cake, and in a sense, you create a sort of souffle. Let's put it that way. You're creating a souffle inside of which there's a reality, which is this cake of the society. And of course, if you put too many egg whites, the souffle gets too big, and the bigger it gets, when it falls, the faster and the more disastrously. It's going to fall before you get it to the table. And of course, when it started falling, what did these men do? They grabbed a bunch of eggs, didn't even separate the whites and the yolks, didn't whip anything. They just started shoving them in. Just shoving in trillions, billions, shoving it in, hoping it would hold the souffle up. And of course, all they've really done, yes, they've saved some banks, but it was very unsophisticated. Because in the process, they've left most citizens in the world deeply indebted. And this was done by the people who said they were against debt, right? Who spent 40 years convincing us we had to give up social services because debt was bad. And they created a debt which is not attached to any kind of reality. So, globalization fundamentally says the market should trump the public place, the market should trump government, that government debt is bad. The crisis comes, the people who said they were against debt and made us fear debt call for government to support them by indebting themselves and the companies very severely. And then once everybody's deeply indebted, and some sort of false stability has been recreated, then the economists and the corporations say, isn't it terrible how in debt you governments are? That's what they're saying right now. It's awful how in debt, this is going to come crashing down on you. But they're the ones, right? They're the ones who said it should never be done. They're the ones who made the crisis happen. And now they're saying the only way out of this is to cut social programming. Because if you tax the corporations, well, they might go somewhere else, or they might go bankrupt, but they already went bankrupt. We already have propped them out of it, in a sense. So we're into a kind of classical lunatic conversation in which 40 years of agony to remove debt ended up with us more in debt than we were at the beginning. And I was just looking at some of the numbers of debt versus GDP of most countries. Australia, again, is a bit of an exception because of the stuff in the ground. But, and you and I and we are a bit of an exception because we have this very, very conservative banking industry to a great extent. But essentially, the world is more in debt. The governments, the citizens are more in debt than they were before globalization began. That's a sign of failure. They said, globalization is about removing debt. And at the end of globalization, we're in debt. So it didn't work. It's like a relationship. It didn't work. Get over it. Get divorced. Do something else with your life. Don't go on pretending that if we just spend another 30 years getting out of debt again, that it's going to work the second time around. We've already spent enough time on that. So what is it that's stopping us from acting in a sensible way? Well, it's partly because there's so few interesting ideas in places of power, which includes the universities. It's partly because, as so often happens, after 30 or 40 years of a system being in power, you're up to the third, fourth, fifth generation of people in power. A CEO lasts 5 years, 6 years. A cabinet minister lasts in a position 5, 6 years usually. Prime minister lasts 4 to 8 years usually. So basically the people who brought the system in and had a little edge and anger and energy to them are long gone. You're looking at the great-great-grandson of the person who built the factory. You know, it's usually called degeneracy. And they don't have any of that edge, just as the Keynesians in the 1960s and 70s didn't have any edge because they'd already been in power through a good part of the 30s in their first wave, and then after the Second World War in their second wave. So by the time the crisis came, they actually had no idea what Keynes would have done. They did exactly the opposite of what Keynes would have done. And in a sense, you could say that the globalists have reacted to the crisis since 1995 by doing almost the opposite of what somebody, like him or not, somebody like Friedman probably would have done. And by the time he died, Friedman had recanted on about half of the things that he'd said, which were at the basis of a large part of the rise of globalization. So, in other words, the intellectuals and people in power are central to the problem because ideologies are built by intellectuals. They are, in effect, like the sacred congregation for the propagation of the faith. The Catholics will forgive me. They're in the business of selling the ideology. They are the servants of the faith. And if they don't wake up to the situation, they become, in a sense, the enemy of the people, as has been said before in history. And if you actually look at, well, who are these people who are the problem? Well, the first problematic group are clearly the professors of economics. They, as I explained earlier, have lost in large part the ability to live the critique of themselves, which is necessary to deal with a crisis. Secondly, the business schools, which have never been in the business of thinking, right? They're in the business of managing, which has nothing to do with thought. They're sort of low-level utilitarians, and it is astonishing to think that the most important place for putting money in universities today, all through the world, is management schools. Think about this very, very sophisticated civilization devoting its primary target for improving universities is management. And in fact, they're so confused they actually can't tell the difference between a capitalist and a manager, or an elected person and a manager, or thought and a manager. I've often said, and I just repeat it for the fun of it, that the real solution there, I mean, obviously the departments of economics are a bit complicated because they're tenured, most of them, but you could send them on a long holiday or something. The business schools, I think it's a lot easier. You could just shut them down. It would do a lot of good both to the private sector and the public sector, and it would save money in the universities. The third group, these are really the people of the propagation of the faith, which is the consulting industry, who are in fact the result of the other two groups. And they sell stuff, ideas, but they're not their own ideas. So they're basically selling the ideas that come out of the departments of economics and the management schools. So they're not even up to date on the nonsense. They're selling old nonsense. And of course, if you're in Australia or Canada, it's old nonsense, because it's all coming from the United States. So you're getting it about 10 years after it's really invented, and after it's already failed where it was first tried out. And then fourth, the economic journalists. I mean, one does feel sorry for them. They're badly paid. It's a tough job. They really don't know much. And of course, it's disastrous because having been so wrong over the years, how are they to admit that they got it that wrong? And still keep their jobs? Why would you read their columns if they're so wrong all the time? So, I mean, those people, if you think about it, those people are very problematic to us getting on with what needs to be done. It really adds up to what I would call low-level scholasticism in the medieval sense. When I came here in '99, I met what changed my mind about what was happening, or made me make up my mind, was I had a meeting with the then head of the Reserve Bank, Mr. McFarlane, who was privately saying that he and most of the other heads of the Reserve Banks thought that the financial system as it was developing in the world was a disaster, and it was going to lead to a catastrophe. And he was saying that quite discreetly, as were a number of them. In those days, they were much more careful, but he was still saying it if anybody wanted to read it. He wouldn't have said this, but I would say it, as I said a few moments ago, that in essence, we were living the results of cobbling together this mid-19th century English idea of free trade, which is a sort of center-left, pro-democratic, pro-justice movement, cobbling it together with a sort of 1850, 1870 English movement, which is unregulated capitalism. So you take the two great enemies of the 19th century and glue them together and announce a new philosophy. That's what globalism was as a philosophy. And of course, you just knew that it couldn't work because the ideas didn't go together in any way, shape, or form. The interesting thing was that, of course, in 1999, that at that point you had two key dissidents in the Reserve Bank world. One was Washington and the other was London. London because they'd abandoned any form of real economy in favor of the city, which is why they've been hit so hard by what's happened. And the United States because they had, I don't know, first of all, they had a not very bright guy running the Reserve Bank, Greenspan. And anyway, you could see from 95 on that this cobbled together bus, one of those sort of buses that go down rocky roads, I don't know, in Bolivia. That's what globalism really was, these various ideas glued together. The pieces started to fall off, wheels came off, mirrors came off, windows broke. And one thing after another, you say, well, there goes that international financial idea. Oh, there goes meltdown in Southeast Asia. Oh, there goes New Zealand. And each time you say, oh, no, that's just, no, that's nothing. It's nothing at all. We don't need that wheel. Oh, no, they don't understand the Malaysians. They don't understand. They're going to fail, and then they succeed. Well, they succeeded, but, don't take it too seriously. It's just Malaysia. That kind of stuff. And it just goes on and on and on. More and more pieces fall off, and the denial becomes more and more outrageous. And at the end of it, by the time you get to 2002, 2003, globalism is verbally going in one direction and in reality going in another direction. There's still all this talk about free trade, but the United States and Europe are busily putting tariffs up against China. And people say, oh, well, the Chinese aren't acting right. Yes, but wait a minute, you're against tariffs. You said you wanted China in because you thought that it would reinforce globalism. Now you're raising tariffs against China. But wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Oh, well, you don't understand. You don't understand, we're just trying to discipline them. Well, but wait a minute, you said that the more goods there are and the cheaper they are, the better it'll be. And now you're saying there are too many goods and they're too cheap. You have to read globalization as if you're reading a very bad novel. And you notice all these errors in plot, these plot errors, where people die or appear, or a play where people appear on stage and say, where did he come from? Or they disappeared, you say, wasn't there another character in this play? I mean, that's what it's like. But because it's sort of run by this boring managerial voice, there's a sense that it isn't comic because it's so boring. Or tragic. But it's tragicomedy, if you like. And of course, you're the beneficiaries of the tragedy part of it. In a sense, when I say we've been doing the opposite, we were promised a maximization of individualism. Instead, the last 20 years in particular has seen an astonishing erosion in privacy for individuals throughout the democracies. The place that led the fight for an expansion of the idea of individualism, Britain, not the United States, is now the country which has the most cameras per square centimeter of any country in the world. I mean, no person can go and have a smoke or an affair without it being recorded in London. I mean, this is the country which said that, globalization was all about the marketplace and we're just going to open everything up and people are going to be individuals and privacy, therefore, the private rights will be of enormous importance. It's the precise opposite that's been happening. That would be an enormous creator of jobs. And as we've seen, there's increasingly part-time, unsecured jobs, and the middle class is increasingly squeezed. We were told that it would be about increasing competition. And in fact, we've seen a return of mercantilism, which is the school preceding capitalism and preceding competition, which is to say, British East India Company, Hudson's Bay Company, the idea that the way to run the world was to have large horizontal corporations which integrated from the raw materials right through to the product without much buying or selling along the way, because the buying and selling would create competition, which would create a difficulty if, in fact, the economy wasn't working terribly well. The idea that people would move around more, that it would be a borderless world. And of course, there are more people moving around. Probably not more than in the late 19th century on a percentage basis. I think you'd find that if you I think I actually have done a comparison of the combined British, French, German, Italian, and American empires in, say, 1910, percentage of the population moving around versus today. I think you'd find it's slightly less moving around today than then. I'm not talking about kids going on a holiday for a month. I'm talking about people actually going and working somewhere else. If you actually look at the numbers, they were absolutely enormous then, and they're quite big now. But in reality, this sort of idea that everybody just moves to where the action is. In reality, how many Australians, go somewhere else because the action is somewhere else? What is it, 5%, 8%, 10%? The other 90% still lives in the same place. They might change cities. They might move a state, but the fact is most people still have to live a real life in a real place. And if you didn't live real lives in real places, we wouldn't have democracy. I mean, that was one of the other problems of globalization, that there was this enormous rise in democracy, only at the same time the nation state was supposed to become powerless. But if the nation state's powerless, that's the only mechanism of democracy. So what is democracy at that point, except a sort of abstract theory that doesn't have reality attached to it? Why did mercantilism come back? Why did the oligopolies come back? It's not simply because we did away with so many regulations. It's because we identified what was happening. We talk all the time for or against the marketplace and capitalism. Well, capitalism is ownership, it's competition, it's technology, it's trade. But the other element in capitalism is scarcity. Right from the beginning, what makes capitalism work is scarcity. If you have not enough goods, then you can have a fight between different producers over who's got the best goods. And then you have a secondary fight over the prices. It's a secondary fight, the pricing, not a primary fight. And one of the great success stories of the capitalist social democratic revolution of the last 200 years is that the Western-style developed economies are now in surplus. We've been in surplus for about 30, 40 years. Probably since the 60s, we've been basically in surplus. Everything in this room, everything you're wearing, this is being televised, everything in the houses of every person watching this, we have too much of. It doesn't mean it's properly distributed. It's not properly distributed, so you have poverty. But there are too many shoes, there are too many sweaters, there are too many cars, there are too many, and you just go down the list. Or there could be. So once you're in surplus, then suddenly the prices don't work, the job market doesn't work, the growth doesn't work, because you don't need growth because you're in surplus. The whole model suddenly doesn't really function. And once you know you're in surplus, then you have to do something else. What we tried to do was to reach out and say, well, let's bring China and India in. Because, of course, those are enormous markets. The only missing point was that China and India, and anybody knew that who wanted to, weren't in the business of buying, they were in the business of selling. So it wasn't going to help us. It was never going to help us. It is not going to help us. We are in surplus, and there are not the markets that we need for our goods. So the effect of being in surplus is that prices are pushed down. This pushes down wages. Suddenly, in order to have the goods, you have to go and get the goods from people who can produce them at lower wages. That doesn't deal with the problem of how you're going to get the income to buy the goods. And in any case, you don't need the goods because we're in a surplus situation. So, and if you listen to what the Chinese were saying, you'd know. I mean, and many people in this country, this is one of the best countries for that, of people knowing about China. If you listen to what they're saying, the Chinese never believed it was going to work. Nobody in China ever uses the word globalization. Whenever you bring it up in China, they say, oh yeah, that's an American idea. That's actually an English idea, but I mean, they never thought of it as something that applied to them. They thought of it as a neat opportunity to sell goods to us. I don't blame them. I'm not even criticizing them. I think I'm criticizing us for being so naive. Meanwhile, in order to try and deal with their internal problems, they brought in things like, in 2005, something called the 5 equilibriums, or the 25 benchmarks for the civil service. Or in 2007, Premier Wen said, the speed of a fleet is not determined by the ship which travels the fastest, but the one that travels the slowest. That's kind of interesting. That suggests he doesn't believe in globalization. He doesn't. We just haven't recognized that they're playing a completely separate game, which may be actually an extremely interesting or intelligent game. And instead of that, we've continued on in this, what I would call, consumption fantasy, that we actually need to produce more to consume more, even though we're in surplus. So it doesn't really matter today whether you're for or against free trade. It doesn't really matter whether you think there needs to be more growth, because that's not going to change anything. What really is needed today is to come to terms with the situation as it currently stands. We're in surplus. We have way too much money that is not real money, which is causing hidden inflationary problems and instability. We haven't figured out how to get ourselves into a new era. What do? Well, obviously the first thing you do is you reduce our dependency on the financial sector. You reduce the size of the financial sector so that it is what in the 18th century they used to call the grease that oils the wheels. That's what it's supposed to do. Secondly, you realize that there are whole other areas of growth which are the equivalent of rebuilding Europe after the Second World War, such as moving from coal-based economies to renewable economies or green economies. That's an incredible opportunity to build new things, which will actually be appropriate to the situation in which we're in. We're still doing the economics, in spite of the reality, we're still doing the economics in the old way so that it looks like it's expensive to go green. Whereas in fact, going green is the only way we're going to create any kind of new growth, which will work for civilizations like the Australian. That's part of the other thing, which is that the whole idea of mass production no longer applies once you move into surplus. Mass-produced apples, mass-produced socks. The more mass-produced, the more you're creating difficulties for yourself. What we really have to do is move into a value-added period. We can afford to create value-added. You say, well, that'll put the price of things up. What about the poor people? Yes, it'll put the price up, but it'll also put the job market back into a solid place, because suddenly you need more people to farm because you're producing better produce. You're producing more interesting goods. It involves more jobs and more complex jobs and better jobs. It's about shifting out of the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century attitudes towards economics and production into something which one could call the 21st century, 22nd century approach. And I've said this before in Melbourne, but I'm going to repeat it because it's related to what I'm talking about. In 1900, life expectancy, according to the insurance industries of the world, life expectancy in the West, which includes Australia and New Zealand, was 50, statistically. Now that includes, children dying and women dying in birth, giving birth and so on. That's the average, 50. We virtually doubled life expectancy in 100 years. This has never been done before. This is an enormous breakthrough, which has to do with things like clean water and clean streets and medical things and education and so on. Most of the ways in which we've organized our society, the management stuff, the economic stuff, the social stuff, was put together, the roots of it were put together in the 1870s and 1880s, Taylorism and so on, management approach towards. And all of the systems we put in place were put in place on the basis that we would be dead at 50. And that's why the kids don't have any idea what to do about when to leave school and when to start working and, when to retire and what do we do about retirement. Because actually the whole structure we're using has to do with the fact that over 50, you're an exception to the rule. Whereas today, dying under 50 is an exception to the rule, which means it's a moment when we should be completely rethinking the way in which we organize not simply the economy, but our education system, our retirement system, what a job looks like, what a career looks like. And if you're asking what I'm talking about here, I'm not talking about any of the old-fashioned right-left divides. It's about 100 years, 120 years, the women's movement. It's been partially successful, not nearly as successful as it should have been because we're still stuck in those old male structures. And every woman in this audience will agree with me on this. If you look at the system, what the system is saying to women who are ambitious is, sure, you can be anything you want, but it's going to be very difficult having a child. It's going to hurt your career. So you see more and more women pushing the age at which they have their children later and later, which is not their choice. It's the male, linear, rational, 1870s, Taylorist approach towards a career that forces the women to push having children until, well, when they'd rather be asleep than up 24 hours a day for a start. And so would their husbands, actually. You know. And you just look at something as simple as that. Well, a lot of women talk about that. Why are they being pushed in that direction? Well, they're being pushed in that direction because we have not re-examined the structure of our society for over 100 years. And it's time to do that. And then finally, we just have to do some very, very simple things like re-examine how we count. More and more people are agreeing that we have to do away with GDP and come up with new ways of counting. We have to look at how we count unemployment. None of the numbers are accurate. None of the inflation numbers are accurate. The unemployment numbers are about half of reality if you count them in any sensible kind of way. But the most interesting opportunity, and that's where I began, is that in countries like Australia and Canada, we have this opportunity to reach somewhere that the others can't reach, which is to reach out to this spatial approach towards dealing with the public good. A completely different philosophical tradition, which I think would be incredibly relevant to what is needed, not simply here at the moment, but elsewhere in the world. There's a kind of leadership which needs to come from places like Australia as opposed to places like the United States and Europe. And that leadership will come, I think, through the ability that you develop to work with the people who have this other approach towards the public good, which is a spatial approach. It's a fantastic opportunity which would free us for action and free us to become interesting leaders in what's going to happen in the next few decades. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to know a little bit more about this idea of the spatial nonlinear approach to our current crisis and what sort of solutions that sort of spatial approach offers.
Well, I mean, the first thing is that, you know, we all know there are many problems also. But that's a separate issue. It's a separate question, and one has to be careful. There's a thing in Canada, we talk about the politics of pity, which is all sorts of non-Aboriginals saying, oh, isn't it a pity? Isn't it terrible? Isn't it? You know, and of course there are some problems, but that actually leads one away from the fact that there are also some very exciting things and some very important things. The other is that, you know, there is inside the European tradition, there are some thinkers who are always shoved to the side like Vico or Erasmus. Now, Erasmus is making a bit of a comeback. You know, but they haven't really come to terms with what Erasmus means, which is actually quite close to the spatial. So there's always in every tradition multiple possibilities, but the rational was so strong that it just shoved somebody like Vico. I mean, Vico is amazing. I mean, you know, what other philosopher is there who's adored by conservatives and communists alike? I mean, clearly he had some kind of idea, which was another idea, which was not the sort of building block, absolute proof. The interesting thing about the Western approach is that it always claims that it's scientific. The social scientists, listen to that. What's scientific about them? I have no idea. I mean, I've got a PhD in that area, and I don't think it has anything to do with science. And all the good scientists I know don't believe any of the approaches used by the social scientists. I mean, that kind of block building, footnoting, getting yourself to a truth because you've got a bunch of numbers, I mean, most scientists think that's nonsense. And they spend most of the great scientists I know, you know, the kind of really great scientists spend their free time reading poetry and singing and things like that, you know, because they know that the breakthroughs they need to make are in the imagination. Whereas the political scientists are busily adding up footnotes. I'm being a little unkind here because I'm trying to get your attention on this issue, you know. And I always attack things that I am partly myself. like political scientists. But, so, I mean, I think that it allows one to look at, to step outside of the issues as they're currently presented. And so if you say, well, actually, the agricultural industry, you already know there's a problem when it's called industry. You already know if we have way too many apples, then we should have fewer apples. Well, how do you get fewer apples? Well, the really stupid linear Western way is you pay people to stop producing apples. So you've got a linear progress, and you pay people to go backwards. Right? I mean, it's complete nonsense. So obviously the smart thing you say is, look, we got a surplus of apples by going down an industrial road which involves approximately 32 chemicals put on an apple from the beginning to the end. I mean, I did a little work on that once. Now, at one extreme, you could go to the organic. But actually, if you just start reducing some of the more offensive chemicals, get it down to 20, the production will go down by X percent, and the quality will go up by X percent. And you'll need this many more people to produce them. And the apple will get, probably the price of the apple in the store might go up a bit, but the people, if you do it properly, who will really be squeezed are the middlemen, who are actually the people who've taken all the money in agriculture. Right? It's not the farmers who've got the money. Can you grab me some water, Arnold? Just, sorry. So I just think that you can apply this approach all over the place. You can apply it in finance. I mean, finance, if you talk to really good bankers, they all think spatially. You know, the bad bankers confuse spatial thinking for speculative thinking. It's not the same thing. I mean, I actually have a lot of time for some of the really good merchant bankers because they're some of the best thinkers around. Because they sort of see it all together. They see politics, and they see societies, and they see economics, and they think, what will it all look like? They're always asking themselves, what will it all look like? But it isn't those kind of people who've dominated in the last few years. It's the speculators, and the speculators are a direct outcome of this false science of pretending money is real.
Well, I'll open it up now for questions from the audience. So. We've got the mics. Where are they now?
You know what might be fun? I mean, if I can suggest this, if there were 4 people, we could take 4 all at once, which just to hear what some more people get up off their seats, and we'd sort of hear what they think.
All right.
Is there anybody else?
We'll take it that way. So how many have we got here?
You know, I just think it's less linear. Okay, less one-on-one, which is, you know, interesting in couples, but I'm not sure elsewhere.
And taking into account time, we'll keep the.
So start. Whoever's first there, start.
I wondered whether your theory about surplus also applies to the population of the world.
Mm-hmm. That's one. Any others?
Could you make comment about the concept of creativity and evolution? There are those who believe that creativity and invention, and there are those cultures that have a philosophy that you can actually have to make money out of the air, which obviously means the middlemen. But with an evolutionary process, you're forced to think that there are mutations along the way, but it's an evolutionary, progressive process towards continuous outcomes in a, well, you would say a linear, but I say a spatial, I suppose, from the point of view that there's an ecology in which you've got to invest within. Now, you're very critical about people who are consumers, but we've gone
about
from...
About which, sorry? Critical about?
Consumers.
Yeah.
And you talk about the individual, but the individual can't create the society, and there's a Thatcher comment about society and the individual. You do require that... Sorry, it is necessary because you're talking globally, or spatially. Let me think that we've moved from the hunter-gatherer to where an individual can produce more than what he needs for himself, which means that he can sell that to someone else who can sit and think without having to produce his own food, and that's how we are evolving.
Oh, okay, that's great. I get it. I get the question. Yeah. Next person.
My question is about your up here.
Oh, there. Where was the person who spoke before then?
Over there.
Oh, there you are. Okay, sorry. It's hard to see in the light. Go ahead.
Could you see me?
Yeah.
Is that right? My question is about your optimism and I wonder if you could comment on whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the various events that have been on the news in the last few days. That is, in Europe, the collapse of Greece, or whatever you would like to call it, and the propping up of the state by the financial help. In America, the passing of the Obama new laws on restricting banking, etc., etc. In Australia, the idea that we will put a tax on the profits of the companies, the mining companies, they're the three anyway. Do you see, in your terms, that there is movement in the right direction or the wrong direction in relation to each of those three?
Great. Anybody? Yes?
Oh, do you think the Indigenous have a rationality that is actually quite holistic and comprehensive about people's place in the community and on the land? Because I think you did say that they didn't have a rationality, and I would argue that's an alternative rationality.
Well, why don't we start? Have we got everybody for the moment? So why don't we start there? What we've taught solidly for 500 years is that everything that we do that's good or intelligent or modern or whatever has to be seen as rational. And so everything else has been demoted to being either irrational or, if it's good, say ethics or imagination, to being sort of subcategories of rationality, right? And I really fundamentally disagree with that. Everybody's got rationality. Everybody's got ethics. Ethics doesn't owe anything to rationality. Everybody has imagination. Imagination doesn't owe anything to rationality. I wrote a book on equilibrium, which is about seeing human qualities as almost like an atom with these 6 different qualities, which are of equal value, independent from each other, and held together by a tension of positive and negative forces. I don't think we have to prove that anybody's rational or irrational. It's the way in which things are done which is the important thing. I mean, Western civilization, which spends its whole time talking about how rational it is, has acted in an almost totally irrational way for a whole century. Was the Second World War, was the First World War? You just go through the list of the things. Do you consider these to be rational or irrational? The people who are condemning other people for being irrational were the most irrational people, right? And on top of that, they claimed that things like utilitarianism were expressions of rationality. I don't think they're expressions of rationality at all. Rationality is supposed to be about the capacity of human beings to doubt consciously. And then they went from that to saying, and therefore we're going to run management schools. Well, that's apples and oranges. So, I mean, I don't think that my experience with Indigenous thinkers or elders or fire keepers, as they're often called in Canada, is it's not about who's rational and who isn't. It's about a whole different approach towards thinking. And I'll give you one example of that. I want to go on because it's the most. It is, if the others will forgive me, the most interesting question, which is why I'd be tempted to go on and on. I did my PhD in England and France on de Gaulle. And it was a lot of fun. And I came back to be the executive assistant to the chair of the National Oil Company of Canada, a guy called Maurice Strong, who's one of the great fathers of the environmental movement. He did the Rio Conference and the Stockholm Conference and created the United Nations Environment Program. He's now 81, and he's a wonderful guy. Anyway, so I came back from France, and by a pure fluke, he hired me, after 7 years in France, he hired me as his assistant, setting up the National Oil Company. And we had a lot of interests in the high Arctic, so we flew up to the high Arctic to look at all these gas wells and stuff like that. Anyway, we first flew. This is my first time to the Arctic. You know, Canadians are a bit like Australians in the outback, right? It was my first time to the Arctic. I was 26 or 7, and we flew up in a sort of 737 or something. I don't know what it was in 1976 to Inuvik which is on the mouth of the Mackenzie River going into the Arctic Ocean. It's a place where all of the sewage and water run above the ground in heated boxes, because otherwise and the houses are all up on stilts because it's in the tundra, and if you put the buildings on the ground, they melt into the ground and disappear. It's really interesting. And anyway, Morris had organized a meeting with the Hunters and Trappers Association. This relates to what the gentleman was saying, the first question about progress, which is essentially which is really a question about progress. We move on, right? You have to realize that at the time, I had just come from living in Paris and doing a PhD. I had the best cut suits, really fabulous cut suits, and I could do any argument. I mean, I hadn't been wrong for so long. I mean, I was right about everything. And you have a problem, I got the answer, you know? Really a smart-ass kid coming out of London and Paris, a complete fool. I don't know why Morris ever hired me, frankly, but, and so I was thinking, we're going into this meeting with these hunters and trappers, perhaps I can be of help. Complete idiot, right? And so we went to the meeting. Fortunately, I knew enough not to say anything. I was this 20-year-old with this great man, and there were these older men wearing parkas and things, and who we had to have translators because they spoke Inuktitut, and I think there were three groups: the Gwich'in, the Inuvialuit, and the Dene. So it's three different languages. Anyway, 1 hour later, I came out of the room completely confused, because I thought the questions were, you know, well, will there or will there not be oil exploration in the Arctic? You know, what does progress look like? Are you for parks or are you for development? I might be for the parks. And in fact, what I heard was a completely different argument, far more sophisticated than anything I'd heard doing my PhD, from these guys who hadn't gone to school very much. And they were explaining that they really saw everything in a completely different way. They saw their relationship to the place in a completely different way. There are all sorts of indigenous theories in Canada, like Wetaskiwin and Sawak and things like that, which are about the relationship of the human being to the place, as opposed to the human being above the place, which is the European approach, which is what's got us in trouble, made us rich and got us in trouble. And I came out of it actually humiliated, even though I hadn't opened my mouth, because I suddenly realized I'd spent all this time getting this PhD and I really hadn't understood what was going on. And it took me 30 years to get to the point where I could write the book that Arnold was talking about, A Fair Country, where I would talk about these theories and their relationship to modernity today, and how they were in fact postmodern and very valuable to us. So the answer to both the lady's question is, I think I've answered that, but the answer to the gentleman's question is lots of things have changed and have moved and haven't moved. And in a funny kind of way, we've come either back or never left, or now we have to notice that things don't work the way we thought they worked, that actually we don't control things. One of the biggest problems we've got, frankly, and which is direct sorry, I'm pointing in the wrong place, direct contradiction with what you're suggesting. I mean, part of what you're saying is true, but the direct contradiction is one of the reasons we can't deal with things like global warming is because the intellectual basis for looking at the environment is essentially 17th and 18th century European philosophy, early 19th century philosophy. People like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Walden Pond, what's his name, Thoreau. Romantics, I mean, romantics, fun romantics, got nothing to do with the reality of nature. You know, Rousseau, who plays a major role in how we think about nature, is basically, you know, gets up from lunch at his mistress's little chateau in the hills. I don't know if you've ever gone to visit it, and whether she was really his mistress, I'm not sure, but, and goes for a walk in the park where all the trees are in lines. You know, and there's a servant behind to pick up his cigar, whatever, and, you know, fill his glass. And he writes about nature and human beings. This doesn't sound like the outback. This doesn't sound like the black fly-laden forests of Canada, you know, where the national bird is the mosquito, you know, 50 different kinds of mosquitoes. I mean, he didn't know what he was talking about. It was nonsense. But today, if you actually examine how we got to the point of environmental theory today, the roots of it are people like that. So, I think that the spatial approaches bring us to a different approach towards population growth. I mean, I think that's a really interesting subject, but we're not really dealing with it at all seriously. I'm relatively optimistic. I mean, Obama's law sounds not too bad. I don't know how good it is. We'll have to see how it plays out when the lawyers get working at finding the holes in it. You know, a 40% tax doesn't sound particularly high to me. You know, people make a lot of money at 60% taxes, so I don't see the big deal. Apparently they're going to go to Canada if it's at 40%, but of course, I'm sure all the miners in Canada are threatening that they're going to come to Australia for some other reason. So, I've spent my whole life listening to people in the commodities business say that they're going to get up and leave for whatever offense has been put upon them at some point. And they never do, or they go away for 3 years and come back. The fundamental point is that the mines are here. They're not taking the mines. They can go, but the mines are here. You know, I mean, what are they going to do? Say, we're gone. Oh, did you take the coal with you? No, it's here. Oh, well, why did you leave? You're coming back? I mean, I don't know. It's sort of funny, really. And Greece, well, I mean, Greece should never have been allowed into the euro in the first place. I don't know what came over Europe. I just really don't know what came over them. They got into expansionitis and allowed people in without making them follow any rules. I'm in favor of the euro. I think the euro is a fantastic thing. It's an Erasmusian approach towards Europe. You know, an idea of a Europe of the whole in which there is diversity and complexity and a multiple personality order. And it's really, Europe starts to look like Australia and Canada. It's really fun. If they could just get their minds around the fact that it was really fun and interesting. But in order for it to work, you can't have a place like Greece where nobody pays taxes and everything's corrupt. I mean, why did they think that was going to work? And that again is the managers thinking, well, we can manage our way through this. We'll get them in, and then we'll manage them. Well, they couldn't manage them. They couldn't manage them because of democracy. See, they keep forgetting that democracy involves citizens deciding what they want to do. And if you have a corrupt society, then you've got a double problem. They didn't deal with any of that. And that showed really how out to lunch they were, that they thought methodology could win out over people. Anyway, have we got time for any more? Or?
We'll make one last question from the audience, and we'll just make it the one. Yes?
Remind you, the first question was about the surplus in relation to population.
You mean the surplus population?
I guess it was about overpopulation.
Overpopulation. I don't think I have anything really original to say on that subject, to be honest with you. I mean, I know what the problem is, and do you have anything original to say? I wish I did. I mean, I think we all know what the options are, or the ways of coming at it. We all know that population rates drop when in places where electricity goes in. I mean, there are all these old-fashioned things that actually worked. They seem to have been forgotten. Yeah, there's a big problem. Too many people.
I'll end with one last question.
Sorry, not be useful. But you probably know more than I do on this subject.
Well, look, I'll take a non-linear approach to the final question and just ask you a writer's question. I've noticed you've written 5 novels and 10 books of non-fiction. And how do you see that? Do you see the difference between the two, and why is it that you move from one to the other?
Well, I think that I actually don't see any difference between fiction and nonfiction. I think that the concept of fiction and nonfiction was in fact invented by the social scientists. That, these people are making it up, we have the truth. I think that's not true. And the example I always give is that if we asked you what you thought about Russia in general, and then we asked you, examine in your minds where you got your ideas about what you think about Russia, we would find that virtually 100% of what you think about Russia, certainly leading up to, say, 1919, comes from Tolstoy and Gogol and Lermontov and Chekhov and whoever, I don't know, a couple of others, Turgenev and who else? And Dostoevsky, thank you. So about 6 people, 6, 7 people. And that's our sum total of our knowledge about Russia. The interesting thing is that it's true. They were absolutely right. And all the people who then and now have written nonfiction have had very little influence on what we think about Russia. So if you just think about it that way, the second thing is that having written those novels, and I hope I'll write more, it clarifies the mind about how you tell a story and what is the relationship between people and reality and people and imagination and people and ethics. And so I've always felt that all of my books were novels. You know, The Doubter's Companion is written, this little philosophical dictionary, is written exactly as a novel. It's got about 3 or 4 main characters, ideas, and then it has all these minor characters, and then it has characters who you think are going to do something but don't, and then, you know, and all those, it's constructed like a novel. Voltaire's Bastards is entirely written like a Russian novel. It's one of the things that annoys certain people about them is that they don't feel like non-fiction, and that's because they're not. They're philosophy or novels or something. Is that a...
Yes, look, it's a discussion that can go on, but we're over time, and it's been a fabulous evening, and I just wanted to conclude before I thank John by just reminding you that in the foyer we have our information about Melbourne Pen. We have the latest newsletter of Melbourne Pen, and I'd urge you to have a look at that and
join.
And join.
It's your freedom of speech. Join Pen.
I'd just like to say on that note that perhaps the most moving experience that I've had since being a member of Melbourne Pen is usually at the end of the year, around about early December, we have a card writing gathering where we just write cards to writers who are imprisoned, wishing them all the best for the new year and saying we're thinking of you. And we have to write those cards in such a way that we get through the censors. So the lobbying goes on all year, but that's one occasion where we just send a card saying, you're not alone, you're not alone. And just a few years ago, I think it was December 2006, we wrote a card to Hrant Dink, an Armenian Turkish writer, a man of great courage. And we received a reply in April due to the vagaries of the mailing system. But meanwhile, in January, he had been murdered in Istanbul by a Turkish ultranationalist, and just getting that card 4 months late, 3-4 months later, a card that would have been written just days before he died, acknowledging our card and saying how glad he was that people were thinking of him in that situation, was extremely moving and just reminded us of the stakes, the high stakes involved in speaking out in all too many countries. So it would really, really be wonderful if you can join and join in the work and help with that work. And now in thanking John, just very briefly, what came to mind as he was talking was that back there in the late 1960s at Melbourne University, when I actually decided to study economics, and I actually lasted only 2 weeks. I just lasted 2 weeks because the very first lecture I went to, the lecturer actually said, we don't deal with people, we deal with abstract theories. We make the assumption that the human is an abstract. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and I just couldn't bear it. And I went across and did the humanities and the rest of it. But listening to you, I realised that part of what you do is that you are willing to get your hands dirty, to get out there and to look at the economic realities. But at the same time, you're coming at it as a humanist, as a poet, as a philosopher, coming at it with the imagination, and I think very importantly, as both an activist and a thinker, and perhaps most interestingly, when we look at your work on globalism, as distinct from being a globalist, you're a true internationalist. And I think that's a very important distinction between the two. And so please join me in thanking John for tonight's talk.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.